Story 1. The Fog That Remembers. Marcus Webb had been driving through the Appalachian Mountains for 17 years, hauling everything from timber to manufactured goods along Route 58 through Virginia's most remote stretches. He knew these roads the way some people knew their own homes, every curve and straightaway mapped in his muscle memory. On the night of October 14th, 2019, that familiarity would become his only anchor to sanity. The weather report had mentioned fog, but mountain fog was nothing new to Marcus. He'd driven through dozens of them, sometimes so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. This fog, however, settled over the highway differently. It appeared suddenly as he crested the ridge near Glade Spring, not rolling in gradually, but materializing all at once, as if someone had dropped a curtain across the world. The temperature inside his cab dropped so quickly that his breath became visible in the dashboard lights. Marcus slowed his 18-wheeler to 30 miles per hour, then 20. The fog pressed against his windshield like something solid, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. He'd been alone on this stretch of highway, not unusual for 2 in the morning, but the isolation felt different now. The silence was absolute. Even his engine sounded muffled, as though the fog absorbed sound itself. He'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when he saw the first figure. A woman stood on the shoulder, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow faintly in his headlights. Marcus's heart jumped, and he began to slow down, thinking she might need help. But as he drew closer, details emerged that made his hands tighten on the wheel. The dress was old-fashioned, maybe from the 1950s, and it was pristine despite the muddy shoulder. The woman's hair hung perfectly straight, unmoving in what should have been at least a slight breeze from passing vehicles, and her face, as his lights swept over her, was turned toward him with an expression of such profound sadness that it made his chest ache. He didn't stop. Something primal in his brain screamed warnings that overrode his usual helpful nature. As he passed her, he checked his mirror. She was gone, not walking away, not hidden by fog, simply gone, as if she'd never been there at all. Marcus grabbed his CB radio, needing to hear another human voice. Static answered him, thick and oppressive. He cycled through channels, finding nothing but that same static, occasionally broken by what might have been whispers in a language he didn't recognize. He tried his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual in these mountains, but the screen flickered strangely, showing his location as somewhere in West Virginia, over 100 miles from where he knew he was. The next figure appeared 5 minutes later. A man in work clothes stood in the middle of the road. Marcus slammed on his brakes, feeling the load behind him shift dangerously as the truck's tires fought for purchase on the fog-slicked asphalt. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, as 18 tons of metal and cargo bore down on him. At the last moment, Marcus jerked the wheel, feeling the truck lean sickeningly as he swerved around the figure. When he straightened out and checked his mirrors, the man was standing exactly where Marcus had last seen him, still facing forward, arms at his sides. The man's mouth was open, Marcus realized, open wide as if screaming, though no sound had penetrated the cab. Then the fog swallowed him, and Marcus was alone again with his hammering heart and the muffled growl of his engine. He considered pulling over, waiting for dawn, but something told him that stopping would be worse. The fog seemed to have a will of its own. and he had the irrational but unshakable conviction that if he stopped moving, it would fill his cab, his lungs, his mind. So he drove, maintaining a careful 20 miles per hour, hands aching from his death grip on the steering wheel. More figures appeared. A child on the shoulder, holding a teddy bear. An elderly couple standing hand in hand in the emergency lane. A group of men in mining clothes, their faces black with coal dust, staring at his truck as he passed. Each one perfectly still, each one vanishing from his mirrors the moment they left his field of vision. Marcus started counting. By the time he reached 37, he'd stopped looking at them directly, keeping his eyes focused on the white line marking the edge of his lane. Then the fog began to show him things that weren't people. A house materialized on the side of the road, a small cabin that glowed from within with warm yellow light. Through its windows, he could see a family sitting at a dinner table, frozen mid-meal, heads turned toward the road, as if waiting for someone. The house faded as he passed, leaving only fog. A church appeared next, its white steeple piercing through the gray like a knife. The doors stood open, and for just a moment, Marcus heard singing, a hymn he recognized from childhood. But the voices were wrong, layered in a way that suggested hundreds of people singing in perfect, inhuman unison. The sound cut off abruptly as the church dissolved back into fog. Marcus's GPS had stopped updating entirely, frozen on a stretch of road that didn't match what he was seeing through his windshield. According to the device, he should have passed the exit for Marion 20 minutes ago, but no exit had appeared. The mile markers along the roadside had stopped making sense, jumping from 47 to 81 to 23 without pattern or logic. The fuel gauge worried him most. He'd had 3/4 of a tank when he entered the fog. Now it read just under half, which meant he'd been driving for longer than he'd thought. Time felt elastic here, stretching and compressing in ways that made his head hurt when he tried to think about it too carefully. He checked his watch. 2:47 a.m. But hadn't it been 2:30 when he'd entered the fog? How could only 17 minutes have passed? A semi-truck appeared ahead of him, parked on the shoulder, with its hazard lights blinking. Marcus felt a surge of relief, so intense it was almost painful. Another person, another real human being in this nightmare. He slowed down, preparing to pull over, when his headlights illuminated the truck's license plate. Virginia, registered in 1952. The truck itself was a model he recognized from photographs, a Diamond T that hadn't been in production for over 60 years. The driver's door hung open. No one sat in the cab. But as Marcus drew level with the old truck, he saw scratch marks on the inside of the windshield, long gouges in the glass as if someone had tried desperately to claw their way out, or to keep something from getting in. Marcus accelerated, his earlier relief curdling into fresh terror. The old truck vanished in his mirrors, swallowed by the fog that was now pressing so close to his windows that he could barely see 5 feet ahead. His headlights seemed to be losing their power, the beams barely penetrating the gray wall surrounding him. Then he heard the knocking, soft at first, almost tentative, coming from the passenger side door. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking moved to the sleeper compartment behind his seat, to the driver's side door, to the roof of the cab, directly above his head. Tap, tap, tap. Patient, persistent. Whatever was making the sound was all around him now, surrounding his truck as completely as the fog. Marcus's breath came in short gasps. His rational mind knew that nothing could be on his truck while he was driving, that it was impossible for anything to keep pace with a vehicle moving 20 miles per hour. But the knocking continued, moving in a circuit around the cab, always just out of sight. He refused to look, kept his eyes locked forward, hands welded to the wheel. The fog began to thin. At first, Marcus thought it was wishful thinking, his oxygen-deprived brain creating hope where none existed. But no, he could definitely see farther now, maybe 15 feet, then 20. Stars appeared overhead, familiar constellations that told him he was still on Earth, still in his own reality. The knocking stopped abruptly, and the temperature in the cab rose so quickly that sweat broke out on his forehead. Within 5 minutes, the fog was completely gone, disappearing as suddenly as it had arrived. Marcus found himself on Route 58, exactly where he should be, approaching the exit for Meadowview. His GPS blinked back to life, showing his position with bland accuracy. His CB radio crackled with normal chatter, 2 drivers discussing weather conditions to the north. His fuel gauge read exactly 3/4 full. He pulled into a truck stop, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the key to shut off the engine. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. According to his logbook, it was October 15th, 2019. He'd entered the fog at approximately 2:15 a.m. and emerged at 6:43 a.m. 4.5 hours, but it had felt both longer and shorter than that. Time folding in on itself in ways he still couldn't fully comprehend. Marcus bought coffee from the travel center and sat at a table by the window, watching normal people go about their normal routines. A family loaded into an SUV. A woman walked her dog in the grass beside the parking lot. Everything was beautifully, painfully ordinary. He tried to talk about it once, with another driver he'd known for years. The man listened politely, then suggested Marcus might have fallen asleep at the wheel, experienced some kind of vivid dream. But Marcus hadn't slept. He'd felt every second of those 4.5 hours, every spike of terror, every moment of that overwhelming wrongness. 3 weeks later, Marcus was driving through the same area, this time during daylight. Near the crest where the fog had first appeared, he saw a historical marker he'd never noticed before. He pulled over and walked back to read it. The marker commemorated a bus accident from 1953, where 37 people had died when their vehicle went off the road during a heavy fog. 37, the same number of figures he'd counted in the fog. He researched when he got home, spending hours in online archives. The old truck he'd seen, the Diamond T, matched the description of a vehicle that had disappeared in 1952. Driver never found. The church he'd glimpsed was St. Matthew's, which had burned down in 1947 with its entire congregation inside during Sunday service. The cabin belonged to the Morrison family, who'd vanished without a trace in 1961. Dinner still on their table when police finally investigated. Marcus still drives Route 58, though he plans his routes to avoid that stretch at night. He's seen other drivers mention strange fog on internet forums, always in vague terms, as if they're afraid to fully articulate what they experienced. He never responds to these posts, but he reads them carefully, looking for details that match his own encounter. Sometimes, on clear nights, he thinks he can see fog gathering on distant ridges, waiting patiently for the right conditions to descend onto the highway. He wonders what would have happened if he'd stopped, if he'd opened his door when the knocking circled his cab. He wonders if those figures in the fog were trying to warn him or trying to join him. The mountains keep their secrets, and the fog that remembers continues to roll through those remote stretches of highway, carrying with it everyone who ever vanished into its depths. Marcus drives on, one hand always near his CB radio, even though he knows now that some kinds of isolation no radio frequency can penetrate. Story 2. The Cabin That Wasn't There Yesterday. Jennifer Hawkins had inherited the land from an aunt she'd barely known. 43 acres of wooded mountainside in southwestern Virginia near the Kentucky border. The lawyer had been apologetic about the inheritance, explaining that the property was landlocked, accessible only by an old logging road that probably hadn't been maintained in decades. Jennifer, recently divorced and looking for a fresh start, had seen potential instead of problems. She was a landscape photographer, and untouched Appalachian wilderness was exactly what her portfolio needed. She'd driven up from Roanoke on September 3, 2021, her Jeep loaded with camping gear and camera equipment. The logging road was rough but passable, winding up the mountainside through dense stands of oak and hickory. According to the property survey, there was an old home site near the center of her land, though the lawyer had warned her that whatever structure had once stood there was likely long gone. After 2 miles of careful navigation, she'd found a clearing that seemed right, according to her GPS coordinates. The remains of a stone foundation were barely visible beneath decades of leaf litter and encroaching vegetation. She'd set up her tent, built a fire pit, and spent the first night listening to the sounds of the forest, feeling more at peace than she had in years. The next morning, she'd explored her property, taking photographs of moss-covered rocks, autumn wildflowers, and the way sunlight filtered through the canopy. She'd found an old well, its opening covered by a rotting wooden platform that she'd marked carefully to avoid. A rusted cooking pot. 3 grave markers so weathered that no names were legible. Standard remnants of the subsistence farming families who'd once tried to make a living in these mountains. She'd returned to her campsite around 4 in the afternoon, ready to review her photographs and plan the next day's shooting locations. That's when she saw the cabin. It stood at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 feet from her tent, a small structure built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a covered porch stretched across the front. The cabin looked old but intact, its roof apparently sound, its single visible window glazed with wavy glass that suggested handmade panes. Jennifer stood frozen, her camera dangling from one hand. The cabin hadn't been there that morning. She was absolutely certain. She'd walked through that exact spot while scouting photography locations. There had been nothing there but trees and undergrowth. No structure, no clearing, nothing that suggested human habitation. Her rational mind offered explanations. She'd been disoriented, had explored a different part of the property than she'd thought. The cabin was camouflaged somehow, perfectly hidden until the afternoon light hit it just right. But even as she ran through these possibilities, she knew they were wrong. She had a photographer's eye for composition and space. She would have seen the cabin. It simply hadn't been there. She approached slowly, every survival instinct screaming at her to get back in, her Jeep, and drive away. But curiosity, that most human of traits, pulled her forward. The cabin seemed to sharpen as she got closer, details emerging with unnatural clarity. The chinking between the logs looked fresh, almost new. The porch boards showed no signs of rot or weather damage. A wooden rocking chair sat beside the door, positioned as if someone had just been sitting there, enjoying the afternoon. The door was unlocked. It opened silently when she pressed her palm against the rough wood, revealing a single room that should have been dusty and long abandoned, but instead looked as if its occupants had just stepped out for an afternoon walk. A table stood near the fireplace, set for two with mismatched plates and cups. A pot hung from a hook in the fireplace, and when Jennifer moved closer, she could see it contained what looked like stew, though the fire beneath it had long since gone cold. A quilt covered a rope bed in the corner, the pattern intricate and clearly handmade. Books lined a shelf built into the wall, their spines too faded to read in the dim light. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but not decades worth. Days worth, perhaps. Maybe a week. The cabin felt suspended in time, caught between abandonment and occupation in a way that made Jennifer's skin crawl. She pulled out her phone to take photographs, to document this impossible building. The screen showed no signal, which was expected this far from civilization. But when she tried to take a picture, the camera app refused to work. The screen simply went black, staying dark until she closed the app and opened it again. She tried 3 more times with the same result. Her expensive DSLR camera had the same problem. The viewfinder showed only darkness when she pointed it at the cabin's interior, though it worked perfectly when she aimed it at the forest outside. Jennifer backed out of the cabin, her heart pounding. As she stepped off the porch, she noticed details she'd missed in her initial approach. No path led to the door, no worn earth suggesting regular foot traffic. The grass and weeds grew right up to the porch steps, undisturbed. The cabin had no outhouse that she could see, no garden plot, none of the support structures that would have been necessary for mountain homesteading. She decided to leave, to drive back to town and return with someone else, preferably someone with a reasonable explanation for cabins that appeared overnight. But when she got to where she'd parked her Jeep, the vehicle was gone. Not stolen, she realized immediately. The ground where it had been showed no tire tracks, no compressed grass, nothing to indicate a vehicle had ever been there. She spun around, disoriented, and felt her stomach drop when she saw her tent. It had aged. The bright blue nylon was now faded and tattered. The support poles rusted and partially collapsed. Her camping equipment lay scattered around it, deteriorated beyond recognition. The fire pit she'd dug the night before was now a depression filled with years of leaf litter. Everything looked as if it had been abandoned for a decade or more. Jennifer ran. She didn't know where she was running, just away from the cabin and the impossible wrongness of what was happening. The forest seemed denser than it had been. The logging road she'd driven up completely overgrown, in some places invisible beneath vegetation that should have taken years to establish. She tripped over roots and scrambled up steep grades, her photographer's clothes and light hiking boots inadequate for the terrain. She ran for what felt like hours, until her lungs burned and her legs refused to carry her further. When she finally stopped, bent over and gasping, she realized she could see the cabin through the trees. She'd run in a huge circle, or the cabin had moved, or the forest had rearranged itself. She was back where she'd started, looking at that same silvery structure with its impossible perfection. Night was falling, and Jennifer faced a choice that felt like a trap, no matter which option she chose. She could spend the night in the forest, exposed to whatever wildlife called these mountains home, without shelter or supplies. Or she could return to the cabin, with its unlocked door and its room frozen in time. The temperature was already dropping, her sweat-soaked clothes making her shiver. Mountain nights could be deadly, especially in early September, when warm days gave way to near-freezing darkness. She chose the cabin. What else could she do? As she walked back across the clearing, she tried her phone again. Still no signal, but the time display showed 11:47 p.m., September 4th, 2021. That couldn't be right. It had been late afternoon just moments ago. But her phone insisted otherwise, and she had no other way to tell time. Inside the cabin, nothing had changed. The table was still set, the stew still sat in its pot. The bed waited with its carefully smoothed quilt. Jennifer tried the door after she entered, testing to see if it would lock from the inside. There was no latch, no bar, no way to secure the door at all. It simply hung in its frame, neither firmly closed nor fully open, existing in that same state of temporal ambiguity that seemed to define the entire structure. She sat in the rocking chair, too afraid to touch anything else, and watched the darkness beyond the window. The forest was absolutely silent. No insects, no birds, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. Just silence, so complete, it pressed against her eardrums like physical pressure. Hours passed, or seemed to pass. Jennifer's watch had stopped, its hands frozen at 4:32, which she thought might have been around the time she'd first seen the cabin. Sometime during that endless night, she heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps that creaked on boards that should have been too weathered to support weight. The rocking chair across from her began to move, creaking in rhythm with invisible weight. Jennifer pressed herself back in her own chair, frozen with terror, too pure for screaming. The door, which had been slightly ajar, drifted further open, revealing nothing beyond but darkness, more absolute than the natural night. A voice spoke, so close to her ear that she felt breath against her skin. "You shouldn't be here." It was a woman's voice, tired and sad, carrying an accent Jennifer couldn't quite place. Mountain dialect, certainly, but from what era she couldn't say. "This place isn't for the living anymore." "Where am I?" Jennifer managed to whisper. "What is this place?" "Nowhere," the voice answered. "In between. We waited too long to leave, and when the mountain took us, it kept this place too. Kept it just as it was the day we died. We're gone now, gone for real, but the cabin remembers. It pulls people in sometimes, folks who don't know to avoid it. You have to leave before dawn, before the cabin decides to keep you too." "How?" Jennifer's voice cracked. "How do I leave?" "My car's gone, the road's gone, everything's different." "Walk west when the first light comes," the voice instructed. "Don't look back, don't stop, don't touch anything on your way. The mountain will let you go if you're quick enough. But hurry. Dawn's close now, and if the sun rises while you're still here, you'll be part of the cabin's memory forever. Just another thing it keeps." The rocking chair across from her stopped moving. The presence, whatever it had been, was gone. Jennifer sat rigid until the first grey light appeared at the window, then bolted from the chair and out the door. She ran west, or what she hoped was west, with no compass and no certainty beyond the desperate need to escape. The forest seemed to part for her this time, offering clear paths, where before there had been only undergrowth. She ran for 15 minutes, 20, until her legs trembled and her vision swam. Then, suddenly, she was on the logging road, and 50 feet ahead, she could see her jeep, exactly as she'd left it, bright blue and modern and gloriously real. She drove without stopping until she was back on paved highway, then pulled into the first gas station she found. Her phone showed September 4th, 2021, 6:23 a.m. According to the device, she'd been on the mountain for less than 24 hours. According to her body and mind, she'd lived through several lifetimes of terror. Jennifer sold the property without ever returning to it. The deed transfer went through a lawyer, and she insisted on a clause that forbade the new owner from developing the land. Let the forest have it, she'd thought. Let the cabin exist in its pocket of frozen time, undisturbed by anyone else who might stumble into its trap. She still has nightmares about that rocking chair moving with invisible weight, about the voice that spoke from empty air. Sometimes, while reviewing her photographs from that trip, she finds images she doesn't remember taking. Pictures of the cabin from angles she never shot, interiors she never entered. And in some of those photographs, if she looks very carefully, she can see shapes that might be people standing in the background, watching the camera with eyes that hold nothing but endless sadness and warning. She never returned to that part of Appalachia. Some places, she learned, exist outside the normal flow of time, kept alive by memory and tragedy and the mountain itself. Some places wait patiently for visitors, ready to add them to the collection of moments they preserve. And some warnings, like the one whispered in that impossible cabin, are the only mercy the mountain offers to those who wander where they shouldn't be. Story 3. The radio station that played tomorrow. Daniel Reeves spent most of his working life behind the wheel, his 1998 Ford Ranger covering thousands of miles along Appalachian back roads as he serviced cell towers throughout eastern Kentucky and western Virginia. He preferred the solitude of solo work, the quiet satisfaction of troubleshooting equipment on remote mountaintops where the air was thin and the views stretched for miles. On April 22, 2018, that solitude would transform into something far darker than simple isolation. He'd been heading to a tower site near Breaks Interstate Park, taking the back way through Pike County because the main highway was closed for bridge work. The narrow road wound through steep hollows and over ridges, passing through communities that ranged from tiny clusters of homes to single trailers set back in the trees. His radio played classic rock from a station in Pikeville, the signal fading in and out as the terrain changed. Around 8:30 in the evening, as the sun settled behind the western ridges, the radio station he'd been listening to suddenly cut to static. Daniel reached to change the channel, his fingers stopping when a new signal came through with perfect clarity. A woman's voice, professional and smooth, announced, WMTN 104.7 FM, broadcasting from the heart of the Appalachians. It's 9:15 p.m., April 23, 2018, and you're listening to Midnight in the Mountains. Daniel glanced at his dashboard clock, which showed 8:47 p.m. He checked his phone, thinking maybe his truck's clock was wrong. The phone agreed with the dashboard. 8:47 p.m., April 22nd. The radio station was broadcasting from tomorrow, or claiming to, which meant it was probably a gimmick, or he'd misheard the date. He kept listening, curious despite himself. The woman introduced the first song, and Daniel felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel. She mentioned a coal mine collapse near Grundy, Virginia, that had trapped 14 men underground. Rescue efforts were ongoing, she reported with appropriate gravity, but the situation looked grim. Daniel knew the mine she was talking about. His brother-in-law worked there. He grabbed his phone, pulling over to the shoulder as he dialed his sister's number. No signal, which wasn't surprising in this particular hollow. He'd have to wait until he reached higher ground. The song played, something instrumental that he didn't recognize. When it ended, the DJ returned with more news. A school bus accident on Route 119. Minor injuries, all children accounted for and safe. Weather warnings for severe thunderstorms moving through the region around midnight. Local high school football scores, which seemed impossibly mundane, sandwiched between reports of disaster and storm. Daniel started driving again, climbing out of the hollow toward higher ground, where his phone might find a signal. The radio station continued its broadcast from the impossible date of April 23rd, playing a mix of country, rock, and bluegrass between segments of local news and weather. Every detail the DJ mentioned was specific and verifiable, from names of accident victims to exact times of reported incidents. If this was a hoax, it was extraordinarily elaborate. He reached a ridgetop where his phone showed 2 bars of signal. He called his sister. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding relaxed and unconcerned. Everyone at the mine was fine, she told him. No accidents, no problems. Her husband was working the night shift as usual. Why was Daniel asking? He couldn't explain, not without sounding insane, so he made an excuse about hearing rumors and hung up. The radio continued its broadcast, now playing advertisements for local businesses. Daniel recognized some of them, but others were unfamiliar, and one was for a restaurant he knew had closed 3 years ago. The DJ returned with an update on the mine collapse. The situation had worsened, she reported. 2 of the trapped men had been reached by rescue workers, but both were dead, killed by the initial rockfall. The other 12 remained trapped behind a secondary collapse that had occurred when rescuers tried to break through. Daniel felt sick. His brother-in-law, Tommy, had been working near that section of the mine on previous shifts. Was working there right now, in fact, on this shift that was happening simultaneously with the radios tomorrow. He tried calling his sister again. No signal. The road had dipped back into a hollow, and the surrounding ridges blocked all reception, except for that one impossible radio station, still broadcasting clearly from its claimed date of April 23rd. Daniel pressed down on the accelerator, pushing the old Ranger harder than he should on the winding road. He needed to get to the tower site, which was on high ground with clear signal. He needed to call the mine, warn them about a collapse that hadn't happened yet, but apparently would within the next day. The DJ's voice took on a different quality in her next announcement. Softer, more personal, as if she were speaking directly to Daniel instead of to a general audience. For our listeners out there on the road tonight, she said, remember that some warnings come too late to matter. Some things are already set in motion, patterns written into the fabric of time itself. You can't outrun tomorrow. It's coming whether you're ready or not. Daniel felt his skin crawl. That couldn't have been directed at him, couldn't have been addressing his specific situation. It was General DJ Patter, philosophical musing to fill airtime, but the coincidence was too precise, the timing too perfect. He fumbled with the radio dial, trying to find another station, any other signal. Nothing came through but static, except for 104.7 FM, which continued its clear broadcast from tomorrow. A commercial played, an advertisement for a funeral home in Pikeville. The voice listed services available for families dealing with unexpected loss, mining accidents a specialty. Daniel switched the radio off entirely, driving in silence broken only by the Ranger's engine and the rush of wind through a slightly open window. But after 5 minutes, the radio came back on by itself, or seemed to, the DJ's voice resuming mid-sentence, as if it had never stopped. Rescue efforts at the Grundy mine site have been suspended for the night, she reported. Official death toll stands at 6, with 8 men still trapped. Families are gathering at the mine entrance, hoping for news. The mine owner has issued a statement expressing deepest sympathies and promising a full investigation. In other news, Route 460 near Breaks Interstate Park is closed due to a single vehicle accident. The driver, Daniel Reeves of Bluefield, Virginia, was pronounced dead at the scene. Excessive speed on the narrow mountain road appears to have been a factor. He was 34 years old and is survived by a sister and 2 nephews. Daniel slammed on the brakes, the Ranger skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. His heart hammered against his ribs, his breath coming in short gasps. The radio had just announced his death, his own death by name, with accurate identifying details. A death that would apparently occur tonight on the very road he was currently driving. He sat in the stopped truck, hands shaking on the wheel, trying to process what he'd heard. It was a prank somehow. Someone was messing with him, had hacked into his phone or his truck's systems, was feeding him personalized horror as some kind of sick joke. But even as he grasped at that explanation, he knew it didn't hold up. The level of sophistication required, the perfect timing, the integration with genuine-sounding news broadcasts, none of it made sense as a simple prank. The DJ continued speaking, her voice now definitely addressing Daniel directly. "You're wondering if you can change it," she said. "If hearing your death announced before it happens gives you the power to avoid it. That's a natural question. But here's the thing about time, Daniel. It's not a line, not really. It's more like a record, already cut, grooves already carved. The needle follows the path laid out, and all we can do is listen to the song that's already been written." Daniel started driving again, slowly now, hyper-aware of every curve, every shadow, every potential hazard. He would drive carefully, would avoid the accident the radio had predicted. He would prove that the future could be changed, that warnings were useful, specifically because they allowed for course correction. He passed the turnoff to the cell tower site, no longer caring about the job that had brought him here. He just wanted to get home, to get off this mountain, and back to civilization, where radios behaved normally, and time flowed in the right direction. The road climbed toward Breaks Interstate Park, the ridgeline ahead showing dark against a sky still holding the last blue light of dusk. Daniel kept his speed to 25 miles per hour, well below the limit, his eyes locked on the road ahead. He would not crash. He would not become the news item the impossible radio station had reported. A deer appeared in his headlights, bounding across the road from left to right. Daniel's foot moved to the brake automatically, his hands turning the wheel slightly to avoid the animal. The deer cleared his path easily, disappearing into the trees on the opposite side. Daniel felt a moment of relief, then noticed the second deer, a massive buck that had been following the first. The buck stopped directly in Daniel's path, frozen by the headlights, its eyes reflecting green in the artificial light. Daniel cranked the wheel hard, standing on the brake pedal, feeling the Ranger's rear end slide on the worn pavement. The truck's right tires dropped off the edge of the road, finding only air where solid ground should have been. The ridge fell away steeply here, dropping 200 feet into a boulder-strewn hollow. Time stretched. Daniel felt the truck tipping, felt the terrible inevitability of gravity asserting itself. The radio continued playing, the DJ's voice calm and unhurried as she described weather patterns moving through the region. The last thing Daniel saw before the Ranger pitched over the edge was his dashboard clock, which had somehow jumped forward to 9:47 p.m., April 23rd. Tomorrow had arrived, exactly as the radio had promised. They found the wreck the next morning, April 23rd, 2018. The Ranger had rolled multiple times before coming to rest against a cluster of trees. Daniel Reeves was dead, killed on impact according to the state police report. The accident report noted excessive speed as a probable factor, though skid marks at the scene suggested the driver had been braking hard before the vehicle left the road. A deer strike was considered possible, but not confirmed. Daniel's sister claimed his belongings from the truck. Among them was his phone, screen cracked but still functional. She scrolled through his last calls, seeing her own number twice in the hours before the accident. She remembered those calls, remembered Daniel's odd questions about Tommy and the mine. She didn't understand what had worried him, what had sent him speeding down that mountain road in the dark. The phone's radio app showed a saved favorite station, WMTN, 104.7 FM. She tried to tune it in, curious about what her brother had been listening to in his final hours. Nothing came through but static. A search for WMTN 104.7 FM turned up no results. No radio station by that call sign existed in the region, had ever existed according to FCC records. But sometimes, late at night, when she's driving through the mountains alone, her car radio will catch a signal on 104.7 FM. A woman's voice, smooth and professional, announcing the time and date. Always tomorrow's date. Always broadcasting from a future that hasn't quite arrived yet. And sometimes, in those moments, she hears her brother's name mentioned in passing. A footnote in a larger story about time and inevitability, and the warnings that come too late to change what's already been written into the mountain's memory. She changes the channel immediately when this happens, and she never, ever listens to the news that follows. Some futures, she's learned, are better left unknown, some warnings more curse than gift. The mountains keep their secrets, and the radio station that plays tomorrow continues its impossible broadcast, pulling in listeners who drive alone on dark roads and offering them the terrible knowledge of what's coming next. Story 4. The Mine That Breathes. Thomas Aldridge had worked in West Virginia coal mines for 23 years before the industry collapsed and the jobs dried up. When the opportunity came to work as a safety inspector for abandoned mine reclamation projects, he jumped at it, grateful for employment that used his expertise without requiring him to go underground every day. On November 8th, 2017, he received an assignment that would make him question everything he understood about the mountains he'd spent his life beneath. The mine was called Blackwater No. 7. located in McDowell County near the Virginia border. It had been abandoned in 1962 after a methane explosion killed 11 men, the company going bankrupt shortly after and leaving the site unsealed. The state wanted it evaluated for proper closure, worried about groundwater contamination and the possibility of subsidence affecting the county road that passed within 200 yards of the main entrance. Thomas drove out on a gray November morning, the kind of day where low clouds merged with fog to create a colorless world. The mine entrance was easy to find, a gaping mouth in the hillside surrounded by rusted equipment and collapsed outbuildings. A chain-link fence had been erected at some point, but time and weather had pulled it down in multiple places. Warning signs hung askew, their messages about danger and no trespassing faded to near illegibility. He parked his truck and gathered his equipment, hard hat with lamp, gas detector, radio, GPS unit, camera, and a detailed survey map from 1961 showing the mine's layout. He wasn't planning to go deep, just far enough inside to assess the structural integrity of the entrance and determine what kind of sealing operation would be required. In and out in an hour, 2 at most. The entrance tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, the ceiling supported by wooden beams that had somehow survived 5 decades of neglect. Thomas's lamp cut through darkness that felt thick, almost liquid. His gas detector remained quiet, showing normal air quality, which surprised him. Abandoned mines usually accumulated dangerous gases, but Blackwater 7 seemed to be ventilating naturally somehow. 50 yards in, Thomas noticed the first oddity. The dust on the ground showed footprints, boot prints that looked recent, not days old, maybe hours. The prints led deeper into the mine, a single set of tracks from someone walking with a steady, purposeful stride. Thomas stopped and called out, his voice echoing down the tunnel. No response came back except his own words bouncing off stone. He should have turned back then. Every safety protocol he'd ever learned said that an abandoned mine with evidence of recent trespassers was a job for law enforcement, not a solo inspector. But Thomas had worked underground most of his adult life. He understood mines in his bones, and something about these footprints bothered him in a way that had nothing to do with illegal entry. The stride was wrong, the spacing between prints too regular, too perfect. People didn't walk that consistently, didn't place their feet with such mechanical precision. He followed the tracks deeper, his radio crackling occasionally with static. The tunnel branched, and the footprints took the left fork without hesitation. Thomas marked the junction with reflective tape and continued. The air remained clean according to his detector, but he could feel a strange pressure change, a rhythmic variation that reminded him of breathing. In through the mouth, out through the nose. Except this was a mine, and mines didn't breathe. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, what the old maps called the number 3 room. This was where the explosion had occurred in 1962, where 11 men had died when methane ignited and fire had ripped through the confined space. Thomas swept his lamp across the room, looking for signs of the old disaster. The walls showed scorch marks, black stains that decades couldn't erase. Equipment lay scattered, lunch pails and tools abandoned when the surviving miners had fled. The footprints led to the center of the room and stopped, just stopped, as if whoever had been walking had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. Thomas knelt down, examining the ground carefully. No signs of someone turning around. No indication that the person had jumped or climbed. The tracks ended as completely as if they'd walked out of reality itself. That's when he heard the sound. A low rumble that came from deeper in the mine, from tunnels that should have been empty and silent. The rumble had rhythm, rising and falling in a pattern that was definitely, impossibly, breath. The mine was breathing, great slow inhalations and exhalations that Thomas could feel in his chest, in his bones, in the ancestral part of his brain that understood when something was fundamentally wrong. His radio crackled to life with a voice he didn't recognize, scratchy and distant. "Inspector on site. This is Blackwater 7 Foreman. We've got a methane situation developing in number 3 room. Evacuate all personnel immediately. Repeat, evacuate immediately." The voice had the flat quality of old recordings, and Thomas realized with growing horror that he was hearing a radio transmission from 1962, from the day of the explosion. More voices joined the first, overlapping reports of gas levels and evacuation routes. Thomas heard panic rising in their tones, heard someone screaming about fire in the eastern tunnel. The breathing sound grew louder, faster, the mine's rhythm accelerating like a heart rate, spiking before cardiac arrest. Thomas's gas detector suddenly shrieked in alarm, the methane levels spiking from 0 to lethal in an instant. He ran. Training took over, his body responding to danger the way 23 years underground had taught him. He sprinted back the way he'd come, his lamp beam bouncing wildly as he raced through the tunnel. Behind him, the breathing grew faster still, becoming a roar, and Thomas understood with terrible clarity that the mine was preparing to exhale, to blow out the buildup of gas and time and trapped memory in one catastrophic release. The junction appeared ahead, marked by his reflective tape. Thomas took the right fork, heading for the entrance, for daylight and open air, and the normal world where mines were just holes in the ground, not living things with lungs and memory. His radio continued broadcasting voices from 1962, men shouting warnings and prayers as fire consumed them. The temperature rose sharply, and Thomas felt heat at his back, as if the historical explosion was catching up to him, crossing decades in seconds. He burst from the mine entrance and kept running, putting 50 yards between himself and that gaping mouth before he stopped and turned. For a moment, nothing happened. The mine sat in the hillside exactly as it had been, dark and silent and old. Then it exhaled. Not fire, not gas, but something worse. A wave of wrongness that Thomas felt rather than saw. A pulse of temporal distortion that made the air shimmer and his vision blur. When his sight cleared, he saw figures emerging from the mine. 11 men in 1962 mining gear, their clothes smoking, their faces blackened by soot. They walked with that same too-perfect stride he'd followed underground, their spacing mechanical and identical. The men lined up in front of the entrance, turning to face Thomas with expressions that held no recognition, no humanity, nothing but empty repetition. One of them spoke, his voice the same, scratchy quality as the radio transmission. "Methane explosion, November 8th, 1962. 11 casualties. Mine sealed and abandoned." He paused, his mouth continuing to move silently for a moment, before sound caught up. "Mine sealed and abandoned. Mine sealed and abandoned." The phrase repeated, a skipping record, and the other 10 men joined in, all 11 speaking in unison. "Mine sealed and abandoned." Thomas backed toward his truck, unable to look away from the spectral miners. They weren't ghosts, not exactly. They were more like recordings, three-dimensional playback of a moment the mine had captured and now repeated endlessly. The breathing he'd heard was the mine reliving its trauma, building to the explosion over and over, exhaling its dead into the world before pulling them back in to start the cycle again. The 11 figures turned as one and walked back into the mine, disappearing into darkness. The breathing sound resumed, slow and steady, building toward the next cycle. Thomas got in his truck with hands that shook so badly he could barely grip the keys. He drove away without looking back, leaving his equipment scattered on the ground near the entrance. His report to the state was factual and sparse. The mine showed signs of structural instability and dangerous gas accumulation. Immediate sealing was recommended. He included nothing about footprints that led nowhere, nothing about breathing rhythm or temporal echoes, or the 11 men who walked out only to walk back in. Who would believe him? He barely believed himself. The state approved the sealing project. A crew came in and filled the entrance with concrete, burying the mine's mouth under tons of hardened material. Thomas heard later that the crew had complained about strange sounds while they worked, about feeling like something was watching them from inside the mine. But they'd completed the job, and Blackwater number 7 was officially closed, its entrance now a smooth concrete face showing no sign of the darkness behind it. Thomas retired early, taking a job teaching mine safety at a community college where he never had to go underground. He drives past McDowell County sometimes, taking routes that keep him far from that particular hillside. But on November 8th, every year, the anniversary of the explosion, he wakes at 3 a.m. with the absolute certainty that somewhere beneath tons of concrete, the mine is breathing, in and out, building toward its exhale, preparing to release its dead into a world that has moved on without them. He knows that concrete can't stop memory, can't prevent the mine from reliving its trauma. The mountains remember their dead, trap them in loops of repetition that have nothing to do with souls or afterlife, and everything to do with places that hold trauma, like battery holds charge. Blackwater number 7 isn't haunted. It's alive in a way that predates and supersedes human definitions of life. And every year, on the anniversary of its death, it breathes a little deeper, preparing for an exhalation that might one day blow through concrete and stone to release what it's been holding for over half a century. Thomas doesn't go near McDowell County anymore. Some mines, he's learned, are better left sealed. Some darkness isn't meant to be inspected, assessed, or reclaimed. Some things that happen underground stay underground, recurring in endless loops in the breathing darkness, waiting patiently for the day when the seal fails and the cycle can extend beyond the confines of tunnel and stone. The mountains are patient, the mines are patient, and time, in places where trauma has soaked into rock and earth, runs in circles rather than lines, playing the same scene over and over for an audience of dust and shadow, and the occasional inspector who ventures too deep and learns what the darkness remembers. Story 6. The Town That Moves at Night. Rebecca Morrison had been working as a traveling nurse for 4 years, taking temporary assignments that kept her moving through rural Appalachia. The pay was excellent, the work rewarding, and she genuinely enjoyed the transient lifestyle that let her experience different communities without putting down roots. On August 12, 2019, she accepted a 6-week assignment at a rural health clinic in what the agency listed as Harlan County, Kentucky, serving a community called Stillwater. The GPS coordinates led her up a mountain road that grew progressively narrower and more poorly maintained. No signs marked the way, which wasn't unusual in these remote areas where locals knew the routes by memory and outsiders were rare enough that signage seemed unnecessary. After an hour of climbing switchbacks and navigating potholes, Rebecca emerged into a valley that shouldn't have been there, according to her topographic map. The valley was small, maybe 2 miles across, completely surrounded by steep ridges that blocked it from view, unless you approached from the specific access road Rebecca had just traveled. Stillwater sat at the valley's center, a collection of maybe 40 buildings arranged along a single main street. White clapboard houses, a general store, a church with a tall steeple, and a small brick building that presumably was the clinic where she'd be working. The place looked like it had been preserved from 1950, every structure maintained in that same vintage style. No modern construction visible anywhere. Rebecca parked in front of the clinic and grabbed her bag. As she stepped out of her car, she noticed the silence. No traffic sounds, no voices, no dogs barking or birds singing. Just absolute quiet that pressed against her ears like physical pressure. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows that seemed darker than they should be, as if the valley held onto shadow more tightly than normal geography. The clinic door was unlocked. Inside, she found a reception area that matched the town's vintage aesthetic. Rotary phone, on the desk, paper files in metal cabinets, examination rooms with equipment that looked decades old, but meticulously maintained. A woman in her 60s sat behind the desk, wearing a cardigan despite the August heat. Her name tag read, Eleanor Pratt, RN. "You must be Rebecca," Eleanor said, standing to shake hands. Her grip was cool and firm. "We're so grateful you could come. Dr. Patterson has been handling everything alone since our last nurse left, and he's not as young as he used to be. You'll be staying at the boarding house, 3rd building on the left. Mrs. Chen keeps rooms for visitors, though we don't get many." Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon getting oriented, learning the clinic's systems, and meeting Dr. Patterson, a thin man in his 70s who seemed relieved to have help. The patient load was light, he explained. Maybe 20 people on a busy day, mostly routine care and chronic disease management. The work would be easy, the hours reasonable. As the sun set, Rebecca walked to the boarding house Eleanor had mentioned. Mrs. Chen, a tiny Chinese woman who appeared to be in her 80s, showed her to a clean room on the 2nd floor. The furnishings matched the town's period aesthetic. Iron bed frame, quilt coverlet, pitcher and basin on a washstand, despite the functional plumbing. A single window looked out on the main street. Rebecca unpacked and tried her cell phone. No signal, which she'd expected in such a remote location. The boarding house had a landline she could use for emergencies, Mrs. Chen explained, though the connection was unreliable. Rebecca settled in for the evening, reading by lamplight until exhaustion pulled her into sleep. She woke to the sound of movement outside. Her watch showed 2:15 a.m., and through her window she could see lights in several buildings, more activity than the quiet town had shown during daylight hours. Curious, Rebecca went to the window for a better look. People filled the street, dozens of them, moving with clear purpose. They carried tools and building materials, working in the darkness with coordinated efficiency. Rebecca watched as they dismantled the general store, pulling it apart board by board, loading materials onto carts and wheelbarrows. Within 30 minutes, the building was completely gone, leaving only a bare foundation. Then they began rebuilding, but not in the same location. The materials were transported to a new site, 2 buildings down from where the store had been, and reconstruction began. The workers moved in eerie silence, no one speaking or calling instructions. The building rose quickly, impossibly quickly, walls and roof taking shape with inhuman speed. By 3 a.m., the general store stood complete in its new location, identical to how it had been but displaced 20 yards to the north. Rebecca pressed her face to the glass, trying to understand what she was seeing. Other buildings were being moved too. The church was coming apart on the southern end of town, being transported and rebuilt on the northern end. Houses switched positions, their occupants apparently still inside. Lights burning in windows as the structures were disassembled and reconstructed around them. The entire town was rearranging itself, and Rebecca realized with growing horror that this wasn't renovation or construction. This was something else entirely, something that happened in the darkness where normal rules didn't apply. By 4 a.m., the activity ceased. The workers disappeared, not walking away, but simply vanishing as if they'd never been there. The town sat quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, its buildings in completely different positions than they'd been when Rebecca went to sleep. Where the clinic had been on the eastern edge of the street, it now stood on the western edge. The boarding house had moved 3 buildings south, but inside her room, nothing had changed. Rebecca had felt no movement, heard no sound of her building being disassembled and relocated. She lay back in bed, trying to convince herself she'd been dreaming. But when sunrise came and she looked out the window, the town's layout had definitively changed. The general store was in a new location. The church stood where a house had been. Everything was different, rearranged overnight by the workers she'd seen moving in the darkness. At breakfast, Mrs. Chen served eggs and toast without mentioning anything unusual. Rebecca tried to ask casually about the town's layout, suggesting she'd gotten confused about where buildings were located. Mrs. Chen smiled pleasantly and said that happened to everyone at first, that still water could be disorienting until you got used to it. Rebecca wanted to push, to ask directly about what she'd witnessed, but something in the old woman's eyes warned her against it. The clinic was in its new location, and Dr. Patterson and Eleanor behaved as if it had always been there. Patients came and went, mentioning directions and landmarks that matched the town's current configuration. No one acknowledged the overnight transformation. No one seemed to find anything unusual about a town that literally rearranged itself in the darkness. Rebecca stayed quiet, working her shifts and taking notes about the town's layout each evening. Every night, she watched from her window as Stillwater transformed. The pattern was never the same twice. Buildings moved in what seemed like random configurations, sometimes swapping positions, sometimes clustering together, sometimes spreading apart. The workers appeared around 2 a.m. and vanished around 4 a.m., their silent reconstruction work following rules she couldn't decipher. She tried to leave after the first week. She got in her car and drove toward the access road that had brought her to the valley. But the road wasn't there anymore. The gap in the ridges had closed, or appeared to have closed. Solid mountain where she clearly remembered driving through. She tried 3 other directions, finding nothing but steep slopes and dense forest. The valley had no exit, or no exit she could find. When she returned to town, Dr. Patterson was waiting at the clinic. He invited her into his office and closed the door. "You tried to leave," he said, and it wasn't a question. Everyone tries at first, but Stillwater doesn't let people go easily. The town needs a certain population to maintain itself, you see. When someone leaves, someone else has to arrive to replace them. You arrived, which means you're meant to stay. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. What is this place? Why does it move? Dr. Patterson sat back in his chair, looking older than he had moments before. No one knows exactly. The town has been here for as long as anyone can remember. Longer than that, probably. It rearranges itself every night, searching for something. Or maybe hiding from something. The pattern changes, but never stops. Those of us who live here have accepted it. You will too, eventually. "I can't stay here," Rebecca said, hearing the panic in her own voice. "I have a life, family, friends outside." "Everyone did," Dr. Patterson replied gently. "Everyone who's here had lives elsewhere. But Stillwater called, and we came, and now we're part of its pattern. The work is good, the people are kind, and you'll find a kind of peace here eventually. Just stop fighting it. Stop looking for exits that aren't there. Accept that this is where you are now, and it becomes easier." Rebecca refused to accept it. Every night she watched the town rearrange itself, making maps, looking for patterns that might reveal a way out. She explored during daylight hours, hiking to the ridges and searching for gaps. But the valley remained sealed, the mountains impenetrable. Her car worked perfectly, but there was nowhere to drive. Her phone never found a signal. The landline at the boarding house connected only to other phones within Stillwater. Weeks passed, then months. Rebecca's 6-week assignment came and went with no communication from the nursing agency that had sent her. She assumed they'd written her off as missing, another person who'd vanished into the Appalachian wilderness. She wondered if they'd sent a replacement, if another nurse would drive up that access road and find herself trapped in a town that moved at night. The work at the clinic continued. Patients came with their ailments, and Rebecca treated them, falling into routines that felt increasingly normal. The nightly transformations became background noise, something she registered but no longer watched with the same horrified fascination. Dr. Patterson had been right about one thing. Acceptance did make it easier. Fighting the impossible was exhausting. She met other relative newcomers, people who'd arrived in the last decade and still remembered their lives before Stillwater. They shared stories in quiet conversations, speaking of families they'd left behind, jobs they'd abandoned, futures that had evaporated the moment they'd entered the valley. Most had made peace with their situation. Some, like Rebecca, still searched for escape routes that didn't exist. On the 1-year anniversary of her arrival, Rebecca stood at her boarding house window and watched the town rearrange itself. The workers moved in their silent patterns, dismantling and rebuilding with inhuman efficiency. She'd stopped trying to see their faces, stopped trying to understand what they were, or why they performed their nightly ritual. They were part of Stillwater's mystery, and Stillwater kept its secrets. Mrs. Chen found her at the window, and stood beside her, both women watching the impossible choreography outside. "My husband and I came here in 1952, the old woman said quietly. "We were looking for a place to start fresh after the war, after the camps. We found Stillwater by accident, or thought we did. Stayed one night, then couldn't find our way out. That was 67 years ago." Rebecca looked at her, really looked at her. Mrs. Chen appeared to be in her 80s, but if she'd arrived in 1952, she should be nearly 90 at minimum. But she moved like someone much younger, and her eyes held a clarity that didn't match advanced age. "The town doesn't let us go," Mrs. Chen continued, "but it takes care of us. We age slowly here. Disease touches us lightly. Dr. Patterson is actually 103, though he doesn't look it. Eleanor is 91. Time moves differently in Stillwater, just like the buildings move. We're part of the pattern now, maintained like the structures, rearranged like the streets." Rebecca felt something inside her break, or maybe finally heal. She'd been fighting for a year, searching for escape, refusing to accept her new reality. But Mrs. Chen's words offered a different perspective. Not imprisonment, but preservation. Not a trap, but a sanctuary that protected its people, even as it held them. She never stopped missing the world outside. She never stopped wondering about the family and friends who must have mourned her disappearance. But she stopped fighting Stillwater's rhythm, stopped searching for exits that the town had closed. She worked at the clinic, treated patients, lived in her room at the boarding house, and watched the nightly transformations with something approaching acceptance. Years passed, though Rebecca found it increasingly hard to track them. Time in Stillwater was fluid, days and weeks blending together in ways that made calendars meaningless. She aged slowly, her 32-year-old body maintaining itself with unnatural consistency. New people arrived occasionally, drawn by job postings or GPS coordinates, or simple wrong turns that led them into the valley. Rebecca helped them adjust, explained the rules as they'd been explained to her, and watched them go through the same stages of denial and acceptance she'd experienced. The town continued its nightly rearrangements, searching or hiding or simply existing according to rules that predated human understanding. The mountains surrounded the valley like walls, and Stillwater sat at their center, a place outside normal geography and time, where buildings moved and people stayed, and the pattern repeated endlessly under the Appalachian stars. Rebecca was part of that pattern now, rearranged and preserved, held in the town's eternal configuration of mystery and impossible geometry. Story 7. The Watchers in the Fireflies. Graham Fletcher had bought the property site unseen, 20 acres in eastern Tennessee, with a small cabin that needed work, but had good bones according to the real estate listing. After 30 years of high-stress corporate consulting in Atlanta, he was ready for simplicity, ready to trade traffic and deadlines for wood smoke and quiet. He'd moved in during April 2016, spending his days renovating the cabin and his evenings sitting on the porch, relearning the skill of doing nothing. The fireflies appeared in early June, right on schedule according to his elderly neighbor, a man named Roy, who lived 2 miles down the mountain and brought venison jerky as a welcome gift. "Big show this year," Roy had said, gesturing at the woods surrounding Graham's property. "Lightning bugs like these hills, something about the elevation and the trees. You'll see them come evening, thousands of them. Beautiful sight." Roy had been right. As dusk fell on June 3rd, fireflies emerged from the forest in numbers Graham had never imagined. They filled the air like living stars, their bioluminescence creating patterns of light that swept through the darkness in waves. Graham sat on his porch for hours, mesmerized by the display, feeling grateful for the impulse that had brought him to this place. The patterns were what struck him first. The fireflies didn't flash randomly but in coordinated sequences, ripples of light that moved through the swarm with clear intention. Graham had read somewhere that fireflies synchronized their flashing for mating purposes, but this seemed different, more complex than simple biological signaling. The patterns formed shapes sometimes, geometric configurations that held for seconds before dissolving into chaos and reforming as something new. He started photographing them, setting up his camera with long exposures that captured the fireflies' light trails. The images were spectacular, abstract art created by insect bioluminescence. But when he reviewed the photos on his computer, he noticed something odd. The patterns weren't random or aesthetic. They were mathematical, precise arrangements that suggested intentionality beyond instinct. Graham spent hours analyzing the photos, using software to map the light patterns and looking for repeating motifs. He found them. The same configurations appeared night after night, cycling through what seemed like a fixed sequence. He counted 17 distinct patterns that repeated in order, each one appearing for roughly 3 minutes before transitioning to the next. His background was in data analysis and systems optimization. He recognized patterns when he saw them, and the fireflies were definitely creating patterns. But to what purpose? He researched extensively, finding academic papers about firefly synchronization and mating behavior. Nothing that explained the complexity he was witnessing. These weren't mating displays. This was communication. On June 15th, Graham set up multiple cameras to capture the fireflies from different angles. He wanted 3-dimensional data, wanted to understand if the patterns were 2-dimensional displays, or if they had depth and structure. The results were stunning and unsettling. The patterns existed in 3 dimensions, complex geometries that filled the space around his cabin with what could only be described as writing. The fireflies were writing in the air, using their bodies and light to create messages that hung in the darkness before fading. Messages meant for whom? Graham became obsessed with the question. He filmed every night, analyzed every pattern, started building a database of the shapes and their sequences. His renovation work ground to a halt. He barely slept, spending his nights recording and his days trying to decode what the fireflies were saying. Roy stopped by in late June, concerned because Graham hadn't been seen in town for weeks. He found Graham surrounded by computer equipment, walls covered in printouts of firefly patterns, the cabin's interior looking like a conspiracy theorist's hideout. "You need to stop," Roy said, his voice carrying a weight that made Graham look up from his screens. "The fireflies aren't for us to understand. Leave them alone, Graham. Just enjoy the show and don't look too deep." "You know something," Graham said, reading Roy's expression. "You know what they're doing." Roy was quiet for a long moment, then sat down heavily. "My grandfather lived on this land before me. He watched the fireflies too, became obsessed just like you're doing. By the end, he was convinced they were watching him, that the lights were eyes looking in from somewhere else. He died in that cabin, looking up at the fireflies, and his last words were, "They see me now." I was 10 years old, and I've never forgotten the look on his face. Terror and wonder all mixed together. "Where do you think the patterns come from?" Graham asked. "What are they?" "Doesn't matter what I think," Roy replied. "Matters that you stop looking before you see something that looks back. The mountains have old things in them, Graham. Things that existed before we came and will exist after we're gone. The fireflies are just the part we can see, the part that bleeds through into our world. The rest of it, the intelligence behind the patterns, that's not meant for human eyes." Roy left, and Graham tried to take his advice. For 3 days, he stayed inside at night, avoiding his porch and the firefly display. But the curiosity was too strong, the need to understand too deeply embedded in who he was. On the 4th night, he went back outside, set up his cameras, and resumed his observation. The patterns had changed. Instead of the 17 sequences he'd catalogued, the fireflies now created only one pattern, repeating it over and over. Graham filmed it, his hands shaking as he recognized what he was seeing. The pattern was 3-dimensional representation of his cabin, accurate down to the smallest details. The fireflies were recreating his home in light, showing him that they knew exactly where he was, what structure he occupied, how he fit into their space. Then the pattern changed again. The light cabin remained, but new shapes appeared inside it. A human figure, clearly meant to represent Graham, sitting on the porch, and around the figure, hundreds of smaller shapes, firefly-sized, surrounding him, watching him. The pattern held for 5 minutes, while Graham sat frozen, understanding with absolute clarity that Roy's grandfather had been right. The fireflies weren't just creating patterns, they were marking him, acknowledging his observation, with observation of their own. The display ended, and the fireflies returned to their original 17-pattern sequence, as if the message had been delivered and normal operations could resume. Graham sat in the darkness long after the lights had faded, feeling the weight of attention he couldn't see, but knew was there. He stopped filming after that night, stopped analyzing, stopped trying to decode. He sat on his porch in the evenings and watched the fireflies with deliberate superficiality, forcing himself to see only beauty, only the surface display. But he felt them watching back, felt their intelligence pressing against the border between their world and his. Strange things began happening. His electronics malfunctioned regularly, screens flickering with patterns that matched the firefly sequences. He woke sometimes to find his cameras had turned themselves on, filled with hours of footage showing nothing but his own cabin, from angles that shouldn't have been possible. Lights in his house flickered in rhythm with the fireflies outside, as if his electrical system was syncing with their bioluminescence. He tried to leave in August, packed his car, and drove down the mountain with the intention of never returning. But the road seemed wrong, turning back on itself in ways that didn't match his memory. After an hour of driving, he found himself back at his cabin, the GPS showing that he'd traveled in a perfect circle. He tried again the next day with the same result. The mountain, or something on it, wasn't letting him go. Roy found him sitting on the porch 3 weeks later, looking thinner and haunted. "They've got you now," the old man said, sitting down without invitation. "Once they mark someone, they don't let go easy." My grandfather tried to leave too. Made it as far as the main road before something pulled him back. Lived here another 30 years, watched by the lights every summer. What do they want? Graham asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Don't know that they want anything, Roy replied. Maybe they're just curious, same as you were curious about them. Maybe they're studying us like we tried to study them. Or maybe there's something we don't have words for, operating on principles we can't comprehend. Either way, you're part of their observation now. Graham lived on the property for 3 more years. He learned to coexist with the watchers in the Fireflies, to go about his life under their attention. He renovated the cabin completely, planted a garden, adopted a dog from the shelter in town. He built a life that looked almost normal from the outside. But every June through August, the Fireflies came. They still created their patterns, still cycled through their sequences. And at least once each summer, they would create the pattern showing Graham's cabin with him inside, surrounded by watching lights. A reminder that he was seen, that the observation was mutual and endless. He aged faster after the Fireflies marked him. His hair went completely gray within 2 years. His face developed lines that hadn't been there before. Something about being watched by inhuman intelligence wore on him in ways stress and corporate life never had. Roy told him that his grandfather had aged the same way, that the attention extracted a price from those who bore it. Graham stopped trying to understand what the Fireflies were, what intelligence guided them, what purpose their patterns served. Some questions, he learned, were dangerous to ask. Some observations drew attention that could never be fully escaped. The mountains held their secrets, and the Fireflies were just the visible manifestation of something far larger and stranger that existed in the spaces between human perception and reality. He sits on his porch now, watching the summer displays, no longer filming or analyzing. The Fireflies flash their patterns into the darkness, and Graham watches with the careful disinterest of someone who knows he's being watched in return. The attention never wavers, never fades. The intelligence behind the lights remains fixed on him, studying him with the same intensity he once brought to studying it. And every night, as the patterns fill the air around his cabin, Graham wonders what they see when they look at him, what patterns his life creates in their perception, what meaning they derive from his existence. The questions haunt him, but he's learned not to seek answers. Some truths are too vast for human comprehension, and some watchers in the darkness are better left unacknowledged, their attention endured rather than engaged. The Fireflies continue their eternal display, and Graham continues his vigil, both watcher and watched, trapped in a cycle of mutual observation that will end only when he does. The mountains remember everything, and the lights that fill their summer nights see more than any human should be seen, marking those who look too closely with attention that never ends. Story 8. The Road That Only Exists in Rain. Carla Sims had been driving the same route for 6 years, a twice-monthly supply run from Knoxville to a small town called Copper Hill, near the North Carolina border. She hauled medical supplies and pharmaceuticals for a distribution company, following Route 411 south through Cherokee National Forest, a drive she could make half asleep. The route never changed, the timing predictable, the job as reliable as jobs came. On October 31st, 2015, that reliability shattered Rain had been forecast, one of those slow-moving autumn systems that settled over the mountains and dumped inches of water over days. Carla had driven in worse and thought nothing of it as she headed south just after dawn. The rain started light, a drizzle that barely required wipers, but by the time she reached the national forest, it had intensified to a steady downpour that reduced visibility and turned the road into a river. She was 20 miles south of Benton when she saw the exit. It appeared on her right, a paved road branching off from the main highway, marked with a green sign that read, Kingston Springs, 7 miles. Carla frowned. She'd driven this route hundreds of times and had never seen this exit before. Kingston Springs wasn't a place she recognized from any map, and the exit itself looked wrong, too well maintained for a back road, too clearly marked for something that led to nowhere she'd heard of. She almost drove past it. Almost. But something pulled at her, a curiosity that felt alien and intrusive, a compulsion that wasn't entirely her own. Her hands turned the wheel without conscious decision, and her delivery truck took the exit, tires hissing on wet pavement as she left Route 401 behind. The road was perfect. Smooth asphalt without potholes or patches, white lines freshly painted, despite the forest pressing close on both sides. Rain hammered down harder, her wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. Carla's GPS showed nothing, the screen displaying her location as still on Route 411, even though she could see the main highway receding in her mirrors. She drove for what felt like 7 miles, though her odometer suggested it was closer to 15. The road wound through forest that grew progressively darker and denser, trees so thick overhead that they blocked what little daylight penetrated the storm. No houses appeared, no driveways, no signs of human habitation at all. Just road and rain and forest that felt older than it should, more primal than the managed national forest she'd just left. Kingston Springs appeared suddenly, a town that materialized out of the rain like something conjured. Buildings lined a main street, maybe 20 structures total, all built in a style that reminded Carla of early 20th century company towns. A general store, a post office, a church, houses with covered porches and rocking chairs. Everything looked pristine, freshly painted, immaculately maintained. But absolutely no one was visible. No cars, no people, no signs of life at all. Carla stopped her truck in the middle of the main street, leaving the engine running. The rain pounded on the roof, a deafening drum roll that isolated her completely. She tried her phone. No signal. Her CB radio produced only static. The GPS still insisted she was on Route 411, miles from her actual location. She should have turned around. Every instinct screamed at her to reverse course and get back to the main highway. But that alien curiosity remained, pulling her forward, making her open the door and step out into the downpour. She was soaked within seconds, rain plastering her hair to her head and running down her face in streams. The town felt wrong in ways Carla couldn't articulate. Too perfect, too preserved, too still, despite the violence of the storm. She walked to the general store and tried the door. Locked. She peered through the window and saw shelves fully stocked with goods that looked decades old. Canned goods with labels from the 1940s, advertisements for products that no longer existed, a cash register that belonged in a museum. Every building was the same. Perfectly maintained exteriors, locked doors, interiors frozen in time. The church held hymnal boards announcing services from October 1947. The post office had mail sorted into boxes, letters with postmarks from the same year. Houses showed breakfast tables set, beds made, clothes hanging in closets. Everything waiting for occupants who would never return. Carla walked the length of the town, rain soaking through every layer of clothing, cold seeping into her bones. At the far end of the main street, she found a sign that matched the one at the entrance. Kingston Springs, founded 1889, incorporated 1902. Below that, in smaller letters, abandoned 1947, flood. Flood. Carla looked around at the town that sat well above any visible water source, at the buildings that showed no sign of water damage, at the street that remained perfectly dry despite the torrential rain. Whatever flood had destroyed Kingston Springs in 1947, it had left no physical trace. Yet the sign insisted on abandonment, on disaster that had ended the town's existence over 70 years ago. She heard singing, faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but growing louder. A hymn, voices raised in harmony, coming from the church. Carla walked toward it, her feet moving without her consent, that same compulsion pulling her forward. The church doors stood open now, though she knew they'd been closed moments before. Light spilled out, warm and golden, inviting shelter from the storm. Inside, the church was full. 50 people, maybe 60, sat in the pews, all dressed in period clothing from the 1940s. They sang with beautiful precision, their voices filling the space with sound that felt more real than the rain. An elderly minister stood at the pulpit, leading the hymn, his face weathered and kind. Everyone looked solid, present, absolutely real. Carla stood in the doorway, dripping water onto the floor, and slowly the congregation turned to look at her. The singing continued, but their eyes fixed on her with expressions of profound sadness. The minister gestured for her to approach, and Carla found herself walking down the aisle, her shoes squelching with each step. "You shouldn't be here," the minister said when she reached the front, his voice barely audible over the continued singing. "This place doesn't exist anymore. Not in your time. Not in any time. The flood took us all in 47, washed the entire town away in 15 minutes. Water came down from the mountains like the world was ending, and maybe for us it was. We drowned, all of us, right here in this church where we'd gathered for Sunday service." "But you're here now," Carla whispered. "You're real." "We're real in the rain," the minister replied. "When the storms come, when the water falls like it did that day, Kingston Springs remembers itself, pulls itself back together for a few hours, gives us another Sunday service, lets us sing one more hymn. Then the rain stops, and we go away again, back to whatever place drowned souls go. But you're alive, and you need to leave before the rain stops. Because when the town vanishes, anything that's still here goes with it." The congregation had stopped singing. They watched Carla with those same sad eyes, and she understood they were warning her, offering the only help they could. She ran, back down the aisle, out the church doors, into the rain that was already beginning to lighten. The sky showed breaks in the clouds, patches of lighter gray that promised clearing weather. She sprinted to her truck, fumbling with wet hands to get the door open. The engine was still running, exactly as she'd left it. She threw the transmission into reverse and backed down the main street, not trusting herself to turn around, not willing to take her eyes off the town that was already starting to fade. Buildings flickered, becoming transparent, revealing nothing behind them but forest. The road itself began to dissolve, pavement turning to dirt, then grass, then nothing at all. Carla's truck bounced and jolted as the surface beneath her tires changed, and she pressed the accelerator harder, desperate to reach the exit before it vanished completely. She burst back onto Route 411 as the rain stopped. The exit behind her was gone, just dense forest and the highway stretching north and south. Her GPS blinked back to life, showing her position accurately for the first time since she'd left the main road. Her phone found signal. The CB radio crackled with normal traffic. Carla pulled over, her whole body shaking. Her clothes were soaked, her truck muddy despite having been on paved roads moments before. She checked her dash cam, hoping for proof of what she'd experienced. The footage showed her driving Route 411 in the rain. Nothing more. No exit, no mysterious road, no impossible town. According to the camera, she'd never left the highway at all. She drove to Copper Hill and made her delivery, saying nothing about the detour that apparently hadn't happened. That night, she researched Kingston Springs, finding only brief mentions in historical archives. The town had existed, had been a minor mining settlement in southeastern Tennessee. And on October 31st, 1947, exactly 68 years before Carla's drive, a flash flood had indeed destroyed the town, killing all 63 people who'd been attending Sunday service at the local church. No bodies were ever recovered. The flood had simply erased Kingston Springs from the map, leaving no trace that a community had ever existed there. Carla still drives that route twice monthly. She's driven it hundreds of times since that October day, through all kinds of weather. She's seen rain heavier than the storm that revealed Kingston Springs, has driven through hurricanes and tropical storms that dumped far more water. But she's never seen the exit again, never caught another glimpse of the town that only exists in the rain. She knows it's still there, though, somewhere in the mountains, in a fold of time and tragedy. Kingston Springs continues its endless Sunday service. The congregation sings their hymns, the minister leads his flock, and the town waits patiently for the specific conditions that will bring it back into view. A particular combination of date and weather, and maybe the presence of someone receptive enough to see what shouldn't be visible. Sometimes, when she drives through rain in that area, Carla thinks she sees something in her peripheral vision. A flash of buildings, a glimpse of a main street, a sign announcing a town that doesn't exist. She never looks directly at it, never slows down. She's learned that some invitations shouldn't be accepted twice, that some places grant only one warning before they decide to keep you. The mountains remember their dead, hold them in pockets of recurring time that bleed through into the living world under the right circumstances. Kingston Springs is one of these pockets, a town preserved in the moment of its destruction, appearing only when the rain falls, like it did on that terrible Sunday in 1947. The congregation continues their worship, trapped in their last living moments, offering warnings to travelers who stumble into their impossible existence. Carla drives on, following her route through mountains that hold countless secrets. She thinks about the minister's sad eyes, about the congregation that drowned while singing praise, about the town that vanishes when the rain stops. She thinks about how thin the barrier is between past and present, between the living and the dead, between the world as we understand it and the world as it actually exists, layered and strange and full of places that shouldn't be, but are. And every time it rains while she drives that stretch of Route 411, she watches the roadside carefully, making sure no exit appears, no sign promises a town that's been dead for decades. Because some roads only exist in rain, and some destinations, once reached, don't let travelers leave a second time. The mountains are patient, and Kingston Springs waits in its pocket of storm and memory, ready to appear when conditions align, and another driver makes the choice to follow a road that leads to nowhere that should exist in the living world. Story 4. The Hikers Who Came Back Wrong. Sarah Chen had been planning the Appalachian Trail section hike for 6 months, coordinating schedules with her 2 college friends, until they'd finally found a week in May 2020 that worked for all 3 of them. The pandemic had made the planning more complicated, but it had also made the idea of escaping into wilderness feel more urgent, more necessary. Sarah, Melissa Drake, and Kevin Torres had been friends since freshman year at Virginia Tech, bonded by late-night study sessions and shared exhaustion during engineering exams. This hike was meant to be a celebration, a last adventure before they scattered to different states for their first real jobs. They'd started at Rockfish Gap on May 17th, planning to hike south for 60 miles over 5 days, ending at Reed's Gap. Experienced enough to respect the trail but young enough to feel invincible, they'd carried proper gear, filed their itinerary with the ranger station, and set off with the kind of high spirits that only come from perfect weather and genuine friendship. The first 2 days had been exactly what they'd hoped for. Clear skies, manageable climbs, campsites with spectacular views. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, Kevin setting the pace up front, Melissa in the middle, cracking jokes about every muscle ache, Sarah bringing up the rear and taking photographs of everything from wildflowers to distant ridge lines. They'd seen other hikers occasionally, exchanged trail names and stories about conditions ahead, shared the unspoken camaraderie of people choosing to walk when they could ride. On the evening of May 19th, they'd camped near Cold Mountain, settling into their tents as the sun set and the temperature dropped with that sudden intensity characteristic of mountain elevations. Sarah had volunteered for the first watch, sitting by their bear-safe food hang and watching stars emerge in unprecedented numbers, the darkness out here so complete that the Milky Way looked like spilled paint across the sky. She must have dozed off. One moment she was looking at stars, the next she was waking to the sound of someone moving through their camp. Her watch showed 2:47 a.m. She grabbed her flashlight, calling out quietly to see if Melissa or Kevin needed something. No answer. The movement continued, and Sarah realized it was coming from outside the perimeter of their campsite, from the forest beyond the ring of trees that surrounded their clearing. Sarah stood up, her heart rate picking up as she swept the flashlight beam across the dark woods. Nothing, just trees and shadows, and the absolute stillness that comes in the hour before dawn. Then she saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the backwash of her flashlight. 3 people in hiking gear, standing perfectly motionless, facing the camp. "Hello?" Sarah called, her voice carrying too far in the silent forest. "Are you guys okay? Do you need help?" The figures didn't respond. They stood with that same absolute stillness, and Sarah realized with growing unease that she couldn't hear them breathing, couldn't hear any sound at all coming from their direction. She moved her flashlight beam directly onto them, and the light seemed to slide off somehow, refusing to illuminate details. She could see shapes, human silhouettes, but no features, no color, no identifying characteristics. Sarah backed toward Kevin's tent, keeping her light on the figures. She called his name, then Melissa's, urgency making her voice sharp. Both of them emerged quickly, reading the fear in her tone. Kevin grabbed his own flashlight, adding its beam to Sarah's. In the combined light, the three figures became more visible, and what Sarah saw made her stomach drop. They were hikers, or had been. Their gear was old, ancient in fact. Canvas packs and leather boots of a style that hadn't been manufactured in decades. Their clothes were wrong too. Vintage outdoor wear that belonged in a historical society museum, rather than on a modern trail. But it was their faces that stopped Sarah's breath. Each of the three had her face, Melissa's face, Kevin's face. Not similar faces, not people who looked sort of like them. Their exact faces, worn by three strangers in old-fashioned hiking gear, staring at them from the edge of the clearing with expressions of profound sadness. "What the actual hell?" Melissa whispered, and the three figures turned in unison to look at her. Their movements were synchronized perfectly, inhumanly coordinated. They raised their arms together, pointing back toward the north, toward the direction from which Sarah, Melissa, and Kevin had come. Then they spoke in voices that were simultaneously their own voices and something else entirely, layered with echo and age. "Don't continue south," the figures said, the words coming from all three mouths at once. "Turn back. What's ahead isn't meant for you. We learned too late. We're still learning, trapped in the learning forever. Turn back while you still can." Kevin, always the pragmatist, pulled out his phone and tried to take a video. The screen went black. Sarah's phone did the same thing. Melissa's camera, which she carried everywhere, didn't even power on. All three devices were dead, the batteries inexplicably drained. The air around them felt charged, humming with static, but there was no wind, no sound, just the three copies of themselves watching from the tree line. Kevin shouted at them, or at the things wearing their faces, demanding to know what they were, who they were, what they wanted. The figures didn't respond. They simply lowered their hands and took one synchronized step forward. That was enough to break whatever fragile sense of logic was keeping the trio rooted in place. Kevin grabbed his hiking pole, Melissa her knife, Sarah her bear spray. All three retreated into a tight triangle, backs together, facing outward. None of them ran. They all had the instinctive understanding that running in the dark would be suicide. The figures stopped again at the clearing's edge. Their faces, the stolen versions of Sarah's, Melissa's, and Kevin's, slowly transitioned from sadness to something else. Relief, understanding, and then grief so deep it hurt to look at. "We didn't listen," the figures said, "so now we need to make sure you do." They didn't move closer. They didn't attack. They just stood there, shaking their heads in a terrible imitation of human empathy. And then, as if the night itself inhaled, they vanished, not faded, not stepped backward, just gone. The moment they disappeared, the forest sounds returned all at once. Wind, leaves, insects, the ordinary rhythm of a world that should never have fallen silent. The spell broke. The three students grabbed their gear in frantic silence, stuffing tents into packs, leaving food and supplies behind. Sarah nearly vomited from fear, hands shaking so badly she could barely tighten the straps of her pack. They didn't speak again until they'd put a full mile between themselves and the clearing. "We're going north, right? Back to Rockfish?" Melissa asked, her voice small. Kevin, normally the confident one, couldn't manage more than a nod. They walked by headlamps, careful, fast, terrified. An hour passed, then another. By sunrise, they reached a ridge that should have overlooked the valley near Cowcamp Gap. But the landscape didn't match the map. The trail didn't match the map. None of it made sense. They checked 3 different waypoints. They weren't where they were supposed to be. "It's okay," Kevin insisted. "We're tired. We got turned around in the dark. We'll keep going north. We'll get our bearings." They continued. By noon, they reached a trail sign. It was the same one they'd seen the previous afternoon, right down to the graffiti they'd joked about. "Don't go alone at night." They hadn't gone in a circle. They hadn't turned once. But somehow the trail had curved around them, guiding them back to where they started. They stopped. No one spoke. And then Sarah saw it. Boot prints, 3 sets, fresh, heading south on the trail, their prints. Except the gait was wrong. The stride length was too long for Melissa, too short for Kevin. The spacing was off. As if something was pretending to walk like them but didn't know how. They followed the tracks backward with their eyes. Then Melissa spotted something in the distance. 3 figures far up the trail, hiking away from them, packs bobbing in familiar rhythm. Sarah gasped. The hikers were them. Same clothes, same backpacks, same gaits, same steps. Their duplicates didn't look back. "What the hell do we do?" Melissa whispered. No one answered because there was no answer. They weren't following the doubles. The doubles were leading. And the doubles were heading south, toward whatever the warning figures had tried to stop them from reaching. They made camp again that night, though none of them slept. Every snap of a branch, every distant movement sent adrenaline spiking through them. They decided they would go north again in the morning, try a different route, cut off the trail if needed. But before first light, long before dawn, something woke them. Voices, their voices, crying, laughing, begging someone to stop. Sarah crawled out of her tent first and instantly collapsed backward in horror. There, sitting around their extinguished fire pit, were the southern duplicates. Their other selves, laughing, eating, crying, rocking, tearing at their own clothing, twitching in unnatural movement patterns, like they were trying to be human but didn't remember how. Sarah screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat. Kevin rushed out, then Melissa. The duplicates around the fire immediately froze, not frightened, not surprised, just aware. All at once, they smiled. Wide. Wrong. Like their facial muscles weren't built for the expression. "Come with us," the Kevin duplicate said in Kevin's exact voice. "We're learning so much," the Sarah duplicate added in her own voice. "You'll learn too," the Melissa duplicate finished. The real Melissa collapsed into sobs. Kevin dragged her to her feet and shoved her toward the northern trail. Sarah didn't wait. She ran. Melissa limp in her arms, Kevin right behind them. They didn't pack anything. They didn't look back. The duplicates didn't chase. That was worse, because it meant they didn't need to. They were found 2 days later by a group of volunteers off a Forest Service road, miles from where they should have been. All 3 were dehydrated, hypothermic, and severely sleep-deprived. It took hours of pleading before anyone could get a coherent statement out of them. Search teams went to the site the hikers described. They found the clearing. They found the fire pit. They found 3 abandoned tents, but not the ones the hikers owned. These were heavy canvas tents from the 1940s. Inside were rotted sleeping bags, rusted cooking utensils, water-damaged maps, and 3 antique leather backpacks, each labeled with a stitched name patch: Sarah Chen, Melissa Drake, Kevin Torres. Sarah, Melissa, and Kevin never went back to the Appalachian Trail. They quit their first jobs, moved back home, and stopped speaking to each other entirely within a year. Not out of anger, out of fear. Because when they were together, the memories resurfaced more clearly, and the nightmares grew worse. All 3 have reported the same recurring dream. They are hiking again, but not as themselves, as the versions that continued south, the versions that never came back, the versions that are still learning. And deep in the dream, just before waking, they hear a single sentence, spoken in a voice that is their own and not their own. We're almost to the end.